middle of this, Mississippi Summer 1964. Here, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee largely organized a summer campaign in which it promised to go into Mississippi and sort of do a full court press in trying to get African Americans to vote. This may have been the most dangerous place in the country to try that, and as events will show, it pretty much worked out that way. But SNCC, as it was called, advertised across the country for college students to volunteer. Anybody that had an activist bent who needed to or wanted to get something on their resume that was impressive in terms of experience and community service found this appealing, and so they got many takers from around the country. And the event started off promising, but in the middle of it, three young college students, one of them black, two of them whites from the north, one of them Jewish, were sent out to investigate a suspicious church bombing, an African American church that exploded and caught on fire. It appeared to be arson, and because of racist reasons, but they didn't show up and didn't come back from that trip. And after so many hours, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee called the FBI and reported them missing. And pretty soon it became clear that they probably weren't coming back, and so everybody feared the worst. The FBI did get involved and start an investigation into this, and eventually found through some tips from anonymous people in the community in this rural area of Mississippi, the three bodies that were buried in unmarked graves. What had happened is, on their way back from the church they were investigating, they were pulled over by the police and on some nothing charge taken into custody and held until the middle of the night. This was all planned, and when they got back in their car after being set free, there were a number of cars waiting to follow them out into the dark of a summer night in Mississippi countryside. And they were pulled over by a number of cars in the pitch black and taken out of the cars and savagely beaten. And over 1,000 people were arrested on the other side of this. But many churches, by the way, had been bombed or burned. This is 37 here on the screen. So this, yet again, another sign of how dangerous all this activity was. White Southerners, and I don't mean all of them, most of them didn't engage in violence, even if they were racist and white supremacists. But nonetheless, the minority that committed these acts of violence were dedicated to intimidating and brutalizing this movement out of existence. And also 30 African American homes and businesses were bombed or burned out as well. But the investigation showed that a number of higher-ups in the local community, including the sheriff, the deputy sheriff, the mayor, a number of prominent businessmen, seem to have been involved in the crime. Some of them actually at the scene of the crime. I believe the sheriff was acquitted, but the deputy sheriff was convicted. I think the mayor was acquitted as well, but a number of the prominent businessmen were convicted as well. One of the misnomers, by the way, about the Ku Klux Klan and other such organizations is that they were made up of poor white Southerners kind of wearing, pardon the expression, wife-beater t-shirts with kind of an engine block hanging from a tree in the yard. But it surely included such people. but it also included people from all walks of life, lawyers, doctors, and teachers, and prominent businessmen were also often members of the Ku Klux Klan. And this crime, I don't know if it was perpetrated by Klan members per se, some of them I'm sure were, but it did show that kind of diversity of backgrounds in such crimes. Fortunately, a new set of laws had been passed at the federal level, which were kind of maybe the original version of what we now call hate crimes. And it's fortunate they were there, because otherwise what likely would have happened would have been the typical all-white jury acquitting all of these guys, or most of them, because of racist beliefs and kind of the white supremacist solidarity of much of the white South. But since they were tried in federal court, then that was taken away. The problem was that for whatever reason, to get these bills through Congress to establish this legislation that brought such federal cases, the penalties were not that high. So I forget the specifics, but guys got 5, 10, 15 years for murder. But it was better than nothing, because previously, under traditional circumstances, they probably would have got nothing. But this is another tragic end to an important element of the civil rights movement. By the way, prior to Mississippi Summer happening, there was kind of a guerrilla phase to Mississippi Summer, particularly led by one remarkable figure, a hero of the civil rights movement, an African American gentleman named Bob Moses, who was a Northerner and I think a teacher, and he actually was one of those that saw that picture that I mentioned of the 4 college freshmen sitting at the lunch counter at Woolworths as the beginnings of the sit-in movement. And he later claimed that when he saw that picture and the looks on the faces of those African American college students, that he knew something had changed in the South. He thought that before that, the pictures he'd seen of African Americans in the South tended to be kind of cringing and not that determined. But he saw a look of sort of resentment and determination, and willingness to sacrifice, dead serious, that he hadn't seen before, and he decided, so he said, that he needed to get involved in the movement. He moved down to the South. But he went into Mississippi kind of as a commando, as a spy, and started to quietly, secretly try to organize citizens, black citizens in Mississippi, to register to vote. He would get to know some people in the community, find business owners, get them to quietly loan him their shop at nighttime, give them the key, and he'd hold these secret classes where 2, 3, 5 African Americans would show up that he'd recruited, and he'd give them classes teaching them how to pass the voting rights tests that African Americans are forced to take. And then when they were ready, he'd have them show up on a given day. If he trained 5, maybe 2 or 3 would show up. The other ones decided to, against it at the last minute. But he'd march them into the registrar's office at one locale or another in Mississippi, and barge in and say they're registered to vote. It usually took the people behind the desks just completely off guard, because nothing like this had happened for years, if ever. And though he did register some to vote, this was dangerous work as well. He and some of those that agreed to or wanted to register to vote got beaten up outside of the courthouses, the registrar's office, city hall, on more than one occasion. But he made he lived through it to tell the story. But he made an incredible sacrifice to push for civil rights, voting rights for Mississippians. The federal government and civil rights we've already talked about a little bit. in class and saw that the Kennedy administration did initiate the civil rights legislation of 1964 and 65, but the president, Kennedy that is, was assassinated before it went through, though he did make a somewhat brilliant speech coming down very firmly on the side of it being time for a complete equality and civil rights for African Americans. But it was President Johnson that was left to push it through, who did meet with civil rights leaders, including Dr. King, on a number of occasions to confer, to work together in a sense, to some degree. And at the bottom right, you see the president signing the Civil Rights Act into law. These were both extremely important legislation, clearly the most important century construction with regard to civil rights. Some have said these shouldn't have been necessary since there was plenty of legislation, amendments, going back to Reconstruction on the books. Nonetheless, they ended up being necessary and they bolstered African American causes from a legal perspective considerably. So they really were important, whatever we may say. But as I said, also in class, when talking about the Johnson administration, the Vietnam War did get in the way of not just this domestic legislation, but all of his Great Society program, and took dollars and funds away from it at times. But these were important acts that Johnson not only shepherded through Congress with his great parliamentary skills, but actually followed through on as well. I also mentioned in that in-class lecture that the Selma March to some degree coincided with and was in many ways coordinated with this. Quoting from Professor Kendi's book once again, he says that anti-racist Americans had some reason to hope for justice when Congress took up the Voting Rights Bill after hundreds of marchers were bludgeoned on a bridge outside of Selma on March 7, 1965. Yet even with the Voting Rights Bill, the U.S. would not be finished. President Johnson had the courage to declare in his commencement address to Howard University graduates in June, "You do not take a person who, for years, who has been hobbled by chains, and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, 'You are free to compete with all the others,' and still justly believe that you have been completely fair." So Johnson understood that for African Americans, just creating a level playing field wouldn't help them to necessarily help them to catch up in all the ways and all the years that they were behind white citizens. But Selma and the Voting Rights Act, to some degree, mutually benefited each other. We also already talked briefly about President Truman's courageous decision to desegregate the military in 1948. President Truman actually has I think, in many ways, an impressive record on civil rights. He's the first person that established a federal commission to study it, and took a lot of interest and action other than that with regard to civil rights. He's not, I think, given enough credit. We usually talk about Kennedy and more so Johnson, but Truman deserves quite a bit of credit as well. By 1964-1965, the movement was changing considerably, and this is when there was somewhat of a shift from the movement heretofore for about 10 years that had been done almost completely, as I said before, in the spirit of Martin Luther King. And now the movement took sort of a different turn or split, because some of it was done now in the spirit of Malcolm X, who we know had a different approach. Malcolm X's way of approaching civil rights didn't replace Martin Luther King's. It was added alongside it, but it meant that civil rights protesters and leaders activists were somewhat divided between the two. Malcolm X was more militant, as we know, did say that violence might sometimes be necessary in a way that Martin Luther King never would have. Kendi again says in Stamped from the Beginning, more and more battle-worn young activists had grown critical of King's nonviolence and disliked the pains he took to persuade away the racist ideas of whites. More and more they were listening to Malcolm X's sermons about self-defense, about persuading away the assimilationist ideas of blacks, about mobilizing anti-racists to force change. So part of this was Malcolm X saying that Martin Luther King is trying too hard to integrate blacks into white society, which to him came across as kind of giving in to the sort of the dominant white society at the time. However, I should also add that Martin Luther King was quite astute in his entire approach to the civil rights movement, and his commitment to nonviolence was not just based on religious grounds, though it was certainly that, since he was a Protestant minister and pastor, preacher. And so part of his nonviolent approach was based on how he read the teachings of Christ and the Bible. But a big part of it also was practical in his mind. And I do think he had a very solid point to make. That being that if African Americans use violence, pick up guns and use weapons, even if it's in self-defense, white people are not going to see it that way. He understood there was a double standard in the country, so that if, let's say, a white person came home from work and turned on the news and saw 5 white guys standing around a helpless black person on the ground, beating them with clubs in their hands and kicking them, that white guy would probably say, at least he's from the north, maybe from the south, would say, that's awful, that's terrible, that kind of stuff shouldn't happen. But the next night, if the same guy came home and he saw 5 black men beating up a defenseless white person on the ground, he wouldn't say that. He'd be likely to say, you know what, I knew it. Those African Americans, there's just something about them that they're kind of violent, extra violent. So he would sort of, appeal to a stereotype or fall back on a very vague generalization about African Americans that he didn't do the night before, right? When seeing the white guys beating up the African American, hypothetically, he didn't say, "Oh my God, we white people, there's something about us that's just violent." So King understood that though it might be tempting to use violence because we're certainly being brutalized and having to take violence, that if we respond that way, it's going to hurt the movement badly, because he also recognized that for this movement to be successful, they were going to have to get the sympathy and the support of the majority of the middle class white population, which was the majority of the country. And white people, however unfair it may have been, would not see violence by African Americans in the same way as they saw it by whites. So King may have been right that this was the more workable approach, though one can understand the frustrations of Malcolm X and those who moved over to follow him in feeling they had to do something more radical. A good example of the radical changes that took place around 1964 and 65 were the other Watts riots. And if you were to ask the average civil rights activist around this time, why are you getting more militant? Why is it getting more severe? I think the obvious and most likely result or answer would be because we haven't gotten far enough. We've been doing this for 10 years and we've made some gains, but fairly minimal considering the effort and the sacrifice. So we need to step this up and make it put more pressure, even if it scares the white community, by acts of defensive violence. And just a more militant approach. But the Watts riots in LA began as such things often do with a police stop gone bad, which sort of spread into a sort of a spontaneous, irrational riot. Riots almost always end up being irrational. 34 were killed, over 1,000 injured, and 3,400 arrested when all was said and done, with 40 million in property damage done, caused almost 1,000 buildings to be damaged or destroyed. So it's hard to know what explains these kind of outbursts in history. But there are some scholars that believe this is an example of pent-up frustration with the same lack of progress in civil rights, minimal gains that we just mentioned. That's open to question since, again, mob violence always has an irrational component to it, but it could have been both. Another good example of the militant turn can be seen in the Black Panther Party and in the larger Black Power movement. So by the latter part of the 60s, Black Power was coming to increasingly rival Martin Luther King's approach. Malcolm X was assassinated right around this time, so the part of the movement that carried on in his spirit did so after he was gone. But Black Power was different than King's approach in one way, others too, but one that stands out. King was trying to get African Americans assimilated into American society to be able to integrate successfully, so to become successful citizens within white society. But the Black Power movement understandably thought, you know what, if white people don't want us to be part of their society, don't want us to live near them or go to school with us, then we'll do things on our own, and we'll celebrate our own traditions, some of them traced all the way back to Africa, and sort of go our own way. The symbol of the Black Power movement was a closed fist, which you see in the upper left, and the most enduring and famous photograph or image of the actual image of the movement were two African American track athletes on the medal stand at the Olympics, with as they're being honored for winning medals, put black gloves on, put their heads down, put the hand up in solidarity with the Black Power movement. This generated a heap of criticism in America. Why? Because to many white Americans, this seemed like ingratitude, because at a time when the national anthem was playing, the American flag was, I'm not sure what was happening exactly at the minute, but you get the picture. They're being honored by America, and many Americans are saying you should feel fortunate that you had the opportunity to represent America as anybody that's in the Olympics should, and that's not a time to make a political statement. And it's a decent enough point. I think it's arguable, but the other side would be, what better time is there to make a political statement than at the Olympics when everybody, the world, is indeed watching? The Black Panthers that we skipped over, I should do these in different order, was a political party that formed more militant than, again, the movement in the earlier years, founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. Newton actually had been a former member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, so he'd seen and been involved in the activities of the nonviolent phase or wing of the movement, and he came to be disillusioned with it and formed a party, political party that was more militant. You can see on the right in the photograph they even carried guns. They're a fairly local product. They originated in Oakland, California, but eventually had a national presence, and they were incredibly controversial. They were targeted by the police. There are many that think they were targeted unjustly in an attempt to shut them down. seen as a radical and dangerous group. And there are others that say the police were out to get them, and that overall they were just trying to protect their own communities in Oakland and other places. But all these, the Watts riots, Black Panther Party, the overall Black Power movement, which this party could be said to be a part of course, are good examples of the militant change that took place around 1965. Keep in mind, Martin Luther King is still around, still an extremely prominent leader, and still has a wing of the movement that's following him. But in some ways, the civil rights movement now is fragmented into two different groups with somewhat different philosophies. We're going to skip the 10-point program. And now we move to the Vietnam War. This it is a war that most Americans, I think, don't learn very much about anymore. Students especially, or maybe never did. I think Americans learn way more about World War II and the American Civil War, possibly because we lost this war and it's such a bitter memory. And so it's not sort of talked about or taught as much. But it's an extremely important war. It's America's most bitter defeat, though we've had a fairly bitter defeat, one could argue anyway, in more recent years. So we're going to look at America's role in Vietnam. But first we need to kind of go back and see sort of add some context to see how America got involved in this in the first place. This is a map of North and South Vietnam after it was divided into North and South Vietnam. And when we start this, going all the way back to the origins of the communist Vietnamese Communist Party, we shall see that it wasn't divided at that point. This was part and parcel of a long-term conflict between the Viet Minh, the communist guerrilla army and political party led by communist leader Ho Chi Minh, and the French. Vietnam had been a French colony prior to World War II, but they'd basically, been impotent during World War II because the Japanese had overrun Vietnam. But after the war was over and Japan was defeated, the French attempted to get their colony back. And a 9-year war ensued between the Viet Minh, under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, and the French forces trying to get that colony back. The United States ended up paying for about 80% of the war effort, siding with the French, which does sound somewhat strange because the United States by this time was at least on record supporting anti-colonialism, but they agreed to help the French get their old colony back. So why would they do that? Because as we should know from studying the Cold War for a while now, the United States is basically opposed to anything that has a communist influence, and this party was a communist party. So the U.S. wasn't about to support this movement for independence by Vietnam, a movement against European colonialism, which it may otherwise have done simply because this was a communist party. We see Ho Chi Minh in his younger years with his most brilliant general, Giap, and both of them sort of teamed up to make incredible things happen in Vietnam.